Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by TechStrong and Everbridge. My name is Cody J. Brown, host of TechStrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation, but we also have a few housekeeping notes first. First off, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, the on-demand recording will be available shortly after the webinar concludes. If you have any questions for Bart today, we want you to submit those into the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. We'll try to address as many questions as you send in, so be sure to send them in early so we make sure to leave enough time. And there's also a chat tab on the right side of your screen, and this is where we want you to talk with one another or just give us your comments on the topic we're discussing today. And finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we'll have a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So on to our topic today, we'll be discussing enabling resilient digital operations. And I'm joined today by Bart Riss, Director of Business Solutions at Everbridge. And it is my pleasure at this point in time to turn the floor over to Bart. Bart, thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for the introduction, Cody. So a little bit more about myself briefly. I have been with Everbridge for a little over 5 years now, and Everbridge specializes in critical event management. So resilience is always a big topic of discussion for us. Specifically, I support our digital operations platform, enabling modern incident response, as well as enabling digital service delivery teams to innovate faster with confidence. And we are going to discuss both of those topics and specifically how digital resiliency ultimately now plays a major factor in organizational resiliency as well. I'm going to start today by just doing a very high level state of the union before we drill in deeper into some of the themes that organizations are running into on the digital front, almost across every vertical and industry. And the first one is big data. The sheer quantity of data is increasing exponentially year over year, which does fuel the sexy buzzwords that we hear all the time, like machine learning and analytics, AI ops. The next is obvious, is the remote nature of the folks that we rely on to make sure that services are always available and reliable. So it's no secret that COVID accelerated the remote workforce, but we're also realizing that this isn't a temporary increase, but rather an acceleration of a trend that was already there. And then digital transformation is another one of those terms that we hear quite frequently in terms of it's very underpinned by automation, orchestration. We see a lot of initiatives tied to this, such as hybrid cloud migrations, and a ton of money being spent by organizations to modernize their technology stack so it could underpin the fundamental operations of the business. And then another one, even in the public sector and pretty much all industries, including healthcare, is the increase of IoT devices. So we do see this in the public sector as the themes of smart or safe cities. And unfortunately, in the news and in recent events, we also see this as an increased threat vector for things like cyber attacks. The more devices that we have that are essentially connected to the internet does pose an increased risk that we do have to keep an eye on from a resiliency standpoint. Now, on that note, this even includes things that are traditionally physical in nature. So when you look at smart cities, for instance, you're looking at devices that actually manage things like public transit, waste collection, traffic lights, potable water provisions, and many, many more. We'll talk about a few quick examples, but an alarming one was actually end of last year, where we saw an example how this could increase risk as a local Florida water treatment facility was actually hacked and chemical levels were able to be altered. Luckily, there is fail-safes in place, so no harm was done by the public, but that is just an example of how IoT devices are truly now impacting physical operations. We've obviously seen something similar with the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline as well. The other theme that we're going to be discussing is bridging that digital gap. So when we mentioned digital transformation, there's a ton of money and initiatives being pumped into these initiatives. Now, sadly, a lot of that investment will actually fail in execution for some of the reasons that we're going to talk about in today's presentation. Executing digital transformation initiatives takes more than just having initiatives, and it also takes more than adopting a DevOps culture, and we'll talk about that as well. And naturally, the faster we accelerate and the faster we innovate, the bigger the risk is that service disruptions will occur. Depending on what study you look into, I've read quite a few of them, there's estimations that approximately 60 and in some cases 80% of outages and incidents are ultimately related to a change. So organizations are also struggling with the battle of innovating faster, and digital transformation by Gartner has also been called, the digital arms race, so to speak. We're all trying to innovate faster, disrupt the industry with new features, but at the same time, we do need to make sure that service reliability is at the forefront. So this balancing act does pose a number of challenges. So when we take a look at being able to be agile in our quest to transform digitally, it's also important to keep value stream mapping in mind. So one of the things that I also wanted to highlight, which we're really finding a challenge among a lot of our customers, is that even teams and organizations that are proud of a DevOps culture that they're adopting, they're often stuck in the middle. And what I mean by this, and this is from the State of DevOps report, it's in the middle means that, hey, teams maybe have the autonomy to automate and really be agile with their particular sphere of influence, but organizations often struggle taking that next step from a cultural perspective to truly be embracing the concepts of DevOps top to bottom. So individual teams may be great and have agile concepts, but the organization at large often still struggles. And this means that there is still those persistent silos in between different areas of the organization. Even within IT, there's often silos between digital service delivery teams, operations teams, incident management teams. And I like this quote that we have here on the slide, and I'll highlight one area of it. And I really like this definition of DevOps, and it really is what you can do to bridge friction across silos. And the technical part actually falls into the definition of engineering. So a lot of teams and areas of an organization really are starting to get the engineering part done, but not necessarily from a cultural perspective, adopting a DevOps culture across all of the areas of the organization. It's also important to call out that value stream management and DevOps concepts don't only apply to software delivery. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about delivery of software. In many cases, it's about increasing revenue, sales, profit margins, customer journey time, etc. And when you adopt the methodologies of value stream mapping, that's where the true value really comes to play. Not all of the value is focused on that engineering component when organizations are adopting a DevOps culture. The other thing I do want to call out is from a digital operations perspective, there are still a lot of challenges. So when outages do occur, organizations still struggle by being able to locate the right resources at the right time. And this is mainly because of those existence of silos and being able to quickly have things like service intelligence in place to automatically engage all of the right individuals that need to be engaged to make sure that as an organization, we could be operationally resilient. It's also no secret that a major outage is also very expensive for the organization. It's no secret more organizations are frankly relying on digital services and infrastructure to support the business at large. If you look at some industries, we have, telemedicine in healthcare. We have e-commerce in retail. As we mentioned before, we have IoT with public sector as well. So when these underlying systems go down, it has significant monetary impact on the organization. Now, the next 2 points are really related, is that presence of silos. And I like exploring silos when I look at a major incident management process, because a typical major incident management process transcends multiple silos. Based on a study, we have 5+. When you think about it, it does make sense. As I stated before, statistically, more often than not, an incident is related to some sort of change. So now I'm interfacing between service operations teams, digital service delivery teams, infrastructure monitoring, change management as well. All of those elements are often in the mix. And a lot of those teams tend to operate in their own silos within their own tools. And technology is an interesting thing, because these tools enable teams to be equipped with purpose-built functionality to address what they're responsible for, but they also reinforce certain silos if those tools are not all interconnected and there isn't information and processes free-flowing between them. And we'll look at some examples as well. Now, from a study that we'll get into in the next few slides about incident management in the age of centricity, a lot of folks claim that they spend more time resolving issues than automating resolution. So this is a lot of things that organizations are now focused on when they look at digital transformation initiatives, is where can I automate? And that ties back to value stream mapping on the previous slide. A value stream mapping exercise is identifying those non-automated or non-value add tasks, so I could make sure that my resources are spending time on higher value tasks. So this 72% of manually resolving issues, well, that is introducing that concept of toil. Instead of being able to work on innovative features and pushing the digital envelope forward, I'm stuck fighting often similar fires over and over again. And from a communication standpoint, we'll talk about some of the elements required to break down silos, and one of them is communication. And it's frankly disturbing that a lot of organizations to communicate outages still primarily rely on email, as that is not a resilient form of communication, nor is it the one that will result in the fastest response time. So when we talk about a lot of these concepts, it's also important to remember that we can no longer treat physical disaster recovery and traditional business continuity and digital security as two completely separate concepts. They really do need to work together, as at the end of the day, the digital side and all of its various areas are now part of the organization's business continuity plans, or they should be. And it all starts when we work with a lot of organizations and our customers. I'm always taken aback how at the very first step of planning, in many cases, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. So plans aren't necessarily shared adequately throughout the organization, and digital security and physical security still tend to operate in a silo, even though they are unavoidably connected. But naturally, when we take a look at some of these key steps, such as planning, it's important that we make plans accessible and that there's alignment to corporate and business goals on both sides. Business impact is a really big one. Having a good understanding of business impact and downstream dependencies of digital services and offerings and what they actually mean functionally to the business is of critical importance, and it needs to be an item that organizations have a really up-to-date vision on from a business impact assessment. From a cybersecurity perspective, once again, that is a separate process, but it should be aligned, and data really should be shared in between the main BIA of the business from an operational resiliency standpoint, that data needs to flow back, because if there are certain risks identified from a cyber perspective, that very much will have an impact on the business as a whole. And then we have to make sure that we're aligning those business and security goals together. And this is where process and tools orchestration is very, very big and a topic we will be discussing. So once we plan, identify, plan for our risks, and now are enforcing mechanisms in place to make sure we keep the organization resilient, we need to be able to do that at scale, and process orchestration is going to be really important. And then collectively, we can't do this in a silo. It really does need to be done collectively, analyzing performance metrics, post-incident actions, to be able to continuously improve and adopt that Six Sigma mindset. The other aspect of digital services that I wanted to talk about as well is the fact that a lot of organizations truly understand that for them to be successful, they need to deliver services that customers love. So it's also looking at things from a customer-centric perspective. And that is a cultural shift that we have been seeing. We did survey hundreds of individuals in IT leadership, and it's overwhelming that almost everyone is starting to realize that superior customer experience is a priority in their specific function. And that's good, but it's also important for organizations to draw that direct parallel between what they're doing with their digital services and the direct impact that has on customer experience, because we do live in a time where consumers have a tremendous amount of choice. So this is becoming increasingly important. The example I always give, even internally when I'm running some training sessions, is online retailers. If the website's even slightly slow, or I'm having a negative experience, I won't hesitate for even a second to go to a secondary or even a tertiary option. We're starting to realize that in many industries and verticals, that is also the case. So what we do understand here is that change is the only constant. So a lot of organizations are adopting a more agile framework, and we are seeing an increased velocity in release cadence, which once again, due to the goal of increasing the development velocity, that is a good thing that we're seeing more releases. So if you look at some of the statistics here, and I think the next graph simplifies it as well, is what is the frequency of these releases, but then also what is the frequency of service degradations. We're actually seeing a parallel for organizations that aren't really taking a holistic approach to their critical event management. The release cadence may be increased, but we're still seeing a high degree of service degradation and outages that are being experienced by the customers, which is definitely alarming. And in terms of summarizing that chart, if you actually aggregate the always and the sometimes, one of the questions that we asked is, my team's ability to build out a new service or feature is blank, and almost 3/4 said that sometimes or always affected by customer impacting issues. So we're having increases in release cadence, which is good if it's actually done right and holistically. But then we're seeing an increase in service degradations, and we're now seeing an impact to DevOps teams being able to actually roll out initiatives and new features at the rate that they would like to, because they're getting pulled into fires. And we all know the reality is that, if we were having this conversation years ago, developers were pretty much just responsible for writing code. That is no longer the case. Developers are now also tasked with the challenge of actually supporting the services that are built. In many cases, they are even on call. So their work can get very frequently disrupted by getting pulled into customer impacting issues, especially if we're not adopting things like self-healing services and proactive automations to prevent that from happening. So why is managing critical events so difficult? And it all starts with silos, like I mentioned before. And even when we're starting this conversation from the digital lens and digital services, we're actually seeing that those other silos are very much impacted. Business continuity, life safety, human resources, physical security, IT, those are operational silos that are challenging enough as it is if these different areas cannot communicate, collaborate, and orchestrate tasks that transcend those silos. But it only gets trickier because all of these operational silos then have tools, systems, and process silos within them. So we look at areas such as physical risk monitoring, cybersecurity, employee engagement, digital service delivery is what we really mean there by DevOps. That's usually the methodology that supports those teams. Incident management, crisis management, physical security management, all of those create decades worth of technology investment and processes that are often stifled by running into these various silos. And then at the bottom, we have the integration silos. So those are, processes, and to support those processes, there's decades worth of technology investments that are purpose built for some of these specific functions. So that complicates it even further. A good example that I always run through when we take a look at the intersection between digital service delivery teams and service operations and incident management is the fact that a digital service delivery team, if I'm a web application team, I likely have the autonomy to use my own tools, right? So there's probably some automation tools that I'm using. I'm probably maybe using Jira to track a lot of my issues and potentially even some of my incidents. But once things escalate and it's impacting the business, I may need to conform to using a corporate standard tool like a ServiceNow or a BMC or a Remedy. And examples like that do introduce friction into the process, especially if these tools are not seamlessly integrated. So what can we really do about it? And how can we keep services reliable? From a critical management perspective, what are some of those necessary ingredients for success? So the first thing that we'll discuss is the concept of signal enrichment and noise reduction. So a lot of these different areas on the IT side, if you're looking at infrastructure operations, if you're looking at digital service delivery teams, if you're looking at the NOC, you're going to have a tremendous amount of technology invested in monitoring solutions. And when you get a signal from a monitoring solution, that will cause a tremendous amount of noise if none of those things are necessarily correlated together. It's also not going to provide the meaningful insight you need to expedite how quickly you could triage an issue. So a trigger tells you something is wrong, but how about we proactively check related signals to enrich the communication that we would be receiving from these signals individually? The other thing that we're seeing is, to be successful, we do need to automate wherever possible. So the concept of having self-healing services and run books that could be automated that are service-centric are really important. So if I know as a service owner that a particular issue happens, and I know that 80% of the time I would need to do a service restart or a regional failover, why let it escalate to a major incident, then get pulled in to fix the problem instead of front loading that process and try to prevent incidents in the first place by being more automated and prescribing proactive remediation. Definitely a big theme that we're seeing with a lot of our customers in terms of initiatives that they want to challenge. And now to build off of the concept of signal enrichment, we have service intelligence. So how quickly can we identify the downstream impacts and dependencies? And yes, of course, this is where CMDB comes in. But when I speak to a lot of my clients, I always like to say, a fully built out CMDB in your ITSM system that has all of the dependencies mapped and it's up to date is kind of like talking about Bigfoot. We all know what it's supposed to look like, but spotting one in the wild tends to be a lot more challenging. But it's important that we do automate the process of gathering some of this information and truly be able to arm incident response teams and incident commanders with service intelligence. And then with that service intelligence, being able to also run service-based runbooks as well. So, instead of if I know through triage and identify a dependency that could be causing my outage, how easy or difficult is it for me to be able to trigger a service-centric automation to fix it? So automation isn't only used to prevent incidents, but also could and should be used once we identify a root cause. And then we have operational analytics. Very painful, especially if we have incidents that do transcend a lot of different areas of IT, from monitoring solutions to potentially multiple ticketing systems to potentially multiple collaboration channels. Even the simple task of putting together a consolidated incident timeline is a challenge. And you want to not only put together a timeline, but then have some analytics and insights into fixing the issue and continuously improving. So what are some of my after actions that need to be tracked? So I not only know how I am doing, how did I do, but how will I do in the future as well. So what do these concepts really mean when we kind of put them together in one visual representation? One continuous flow that's also automated. And this is where we have some of these concepts come into play. So monitoring tools are going to be able to provide those signals. And there's going to be a ton of them. That's one of the biggest challenges that organizations have, is the sheer amount of technology investments that are all creating noise. So we need to be able to centralize some of that noise and be able to also enrich it from other areas. So if I do have an alert that's coming in from a monitoring system like App Dynamics, for example, well, from an infrastructure perspective, it may be a good idea to understand what's going on as well. So maybe let's proactively check the RabbitMQ and see how bad this issue really is. Do I have a significant amount of messages that are now building up? So I'm the incident commander. I already know that the issue could be significant. And then let's bridge the gap between digital service delivery as well. Let's check our code base. Let's actually proactively not wait for a monitoring alert to come, but if I get the monitoring alert, let's check for infrastructure signals, and let's also check to see if there has been any recent code committed and deployed into production. So checking things like GitHub or verifying via Jenkins if a recent change was actually committed into production related to an area that may be experiencing a particular issue. So that is kind of the three fundamental areas where we could gather additional insights automatically and then send out an alert. And the same goes for the service operations side, right? Is there a ticket already about this item? Is there a JIRA issue? Or is there an incident issue or problem or change that we could also potentially correlate those incoming signals? And once all of that is done, then we could truly understand who we may need to engage and what information do we need to send them. So this is where we can engage our technical resolvers and automate the often manual process of spinning up virtual collaboration spaces. In the beginning of this webinar, when we talked about some of the 4 really high-level themes, remote workforce was one of them. And it's no shocker that almost every single industry in vertical is relying on virtual collaboration platforms more and more for fundamental business functions and especially triaging IT incidents as well. So get people onto a conference bridge, get virtual collaboration spaces open with the understanding that you may need to do more than one. I've worked with organizations where maybe business communications and stakeholder alerts go on MS Teams. but maybe the more technical personnel are collaborating on Slack. A lot to manage if it is not all tied with a continuous and automated flow. Then you have stakeholder communications as well. So that's where things like a status page, an intranet, a desktop alert will come into play. And then once the issue is resolved, that communication feedback needs to continuously go through the entire process and update all of these tools that we're integrated with. Integrations are really supposed to be bi-directional to achieve two purposes. One, we want to allow technical resolvers to not have to navigate yet another user interface. So the beauty of an incident response platform and a critical event management system is to extend the value of the existing investment. So making sure that all of these tools can be multimodal and these responses could feed back into those systems. So if I look at a ServiceNow, a Remedy, or a Sherwell ticket, I should also have a hyperlink to the Slack channel, the Teams channel, the Jira issue, and vice versa if I'm looking at Jira. So all of these things should be interconnected and free-flowing. But at the same time, it is useful for an incident commander to also have one place to see everything that's happening in all these various systems. It's not really one or the other. There's value in both. Bidirectional and free-flowing of information. So when I'm managing the crisis, having a one-stop shop, consolidated timeline, and full visibility into everything that's going on in my various traditional silos. And then engaging business functions is really important as well. As we all know, more often or not these days, a substantial outage is going to cause a fundamental business problem as well, whether it be impacting my supply chain, whether it be impacting health and wellness of employees, or whether it be impacting the business from a compliance or regulatory standpoint as well, if I'm dealing with something like a security incident. And that's where the value of having a central framework for managing critical incidents is really important, because we have teams with different functions that tend to be globally distributed. And we could have an IT outage, we could have a cyber attack, and by the way, let's not forget our physical assets as well. But even on the digital side, like I mentioned before, what's the thing that links these people together? And that really is being able to effectively communicate, collaborate, and orchestrate processes in between the different areas of IT. That's where a lot of organizations, even ones where you have teams adopting DevOps agile concepts, fail to take it to the next step when it doesn't become a truly corporate culture methodology. And then let's not forget the physical world as well. We have buildings, we have data centers, we have travelers, and those can be subject to physical events, but they all need the same framework. Just like when we're dealing with a physical incident, we probably need to collaborate cross-functionally. Same thing happens when we're dealing with a digital, and oftentimes they are connected. So if I do have an example like an intruder in a perhaps confidential environment, far too often we see those circumstances be treated almost solely by the physical security team, because they're the ones that manage physical security systems. And oftentimes maybe the digital security team doesn't even know. Well, that is a flaw, because if I do have someone that accesses a confidential area of the building, that naturally increases the risk, even from a cyber perspective, based on what information they could or could not have been exposed to. So that's where another example where we truly need to break down those silos, as something like a physical intrusion and cybersecurity truly do come together, and these teams do need to collaborate. So what I wanted to take a look at now is, now that we built the understanding that critical event management is its own fundamental framework that does really link to every internal or external incident that could impact the operational resilience of the organization. So what does that framework really look like? So let's keep looking at it from a digital perspective, such as a IT system failure. And in critical event management, what we typically do is break it down into 4 very high-level fundamental phases, which is assess, locate, act, and analyze. So when we're going from an assess perspective, when we're dealing with critical event management, this is where it begins, where we need to aggregate tons of technology investment within an organization. And this is often, when organizations are even looking for budgeting and planning for digital transformation initiatives, it's important that we make current investments hum before we're able to, consolidate and take on new challenges. There's a ton of different tools in physical security, SIM, cyber, service management, a lot of technology investments that often are not really working together. And it's important to alert and get data from all these various sources. But an alert in itself isn't that modern and isn't that much of an exciting concept. What is exciting is when we're able to take alerts and information from all of these various systems and be able to enrich it before we receive that alert. You probably lost me right around when we talked about this slide, so I'll try to make up a little bit of time. When we talk about signal enrichment and receiving information from all these various systems, it's really important that we take it a step further than just regurgitating information a monitoring solution can throw my way. So if I receive an alert from New Relic, for example, well, that's great. I could see what happened from an alert perspective, but what I really need is diagnostic information. So signal enrichment means let me go fetch maybe potentially related information, such as the fact that there is over 7,500 messages jamming up my RabbitMQ. And based on this alert, I could also check to see in the code base, in this example, GitHub, was there recent code committed related to this service? So in this case, the screenshot's too small, but what it's essentially telling me is about 30 minutes after this New Relic alert initially came in, I actually had code that was committed into GitHub. And then if we take it a step further, I could automate into deployment pipeline tools such as Jenkins to verify that this code was actually pushed into production. And not only that, one of the ingredients to success that we talked about is we want to actually try to remediate services before they bubble up into a major incident. So in this case, if I'm the resolver, I'm getting tons of insight that I could use for triage purposes that let me know, hey, this may be related to a change. It is also causing issues from an infrastructure perspective. And by the way, an automated runbook was already attempted, but it failed to execute because I have an issue with the service that's actually related to the code base. So just getting that alert is actually telling me what may have caused this to happen. And this is an example of, instead of receiving alerts and checking for signals manually, we should be able to aggregate that data to truly help us to assess the severity of a outage. So going along the wheel as well, once we have an idea of what is going on and how severe it is, it's important that we locate the responsible parties. And this is where statistically, I think we had that stat that up to 70% of MTTR in a major incident is spent on finding the right people. And there's a number of things that come into play here. First, we need to have an understanding of service and application intelligence. So is this impacting a mission critical application or service? What is the actual priority of this issue? And then ultimately finding who is actually available to help. The bottom two will help me identify who is responsible, but I still need the capability to find who is available. And now, given the fact that a lot of IT personnel are remote, this could often be more challenging than traditionally, especially on the operations side, where people would be, in a network operations center, staring at a bunch of monitors. So how do I actually do this effectively? This does bring up the concept of service intelligence. So being able to visualize downstream dependencies of why a service could potentially be down. So being able to identify the common denominator, so to speak. So in this example, we maybe have the visualization of, hey, we have an issue with our API gateway, we have an issue with that inventory order service, and they're both relying on a proxy service. That could be my potential root cause. So being able to visualize that potential root cause and then seamlessly be able to engage the team that owns that particular service will greatly expedite how quickly it takes me to, how much time it takes me to locate the responsible parties. So now let's move on to ACT, and ACT is a big one because this is where you see a lot of the digital transformation initiatives. On ACT, this is where we truly are able to streamline and break down silos at a very high level. So collaboration is really phase one. Making sure that we can automate and collaborate cross-functionally is really important. And an example is how quickly it takes me to realize that issues are related to a common problem. So maybe in a service desk, people are reporting server slowness, and it eventually escalates and there's a bridge. But then on the other side of the fence, I have my info security team that eventually realizes that maybe there's something like a DDoS event that's actually causing that server slowness. How quickly can I build that virtual collaboration hub and make sure that I'm not operating within silos, but really collapsing and consolidating those work streams? Going back to service intelligence, the piece that is important, the third piece, is actually then being able to run service-centric automations. So just like we covered in the presentation before, that proactive runbooks are important, prevent the incident from happening is ideally the case. But now that I'm triaging the incident, identified the root cause, and I could pin it to a service, be able to easily run service-centric automations without having to jump through too many hoops. And that's going to be extremely important to stop the bleeding. In many cases, maybe I have to do a failover, which doesn't mean my incident's over, still plenty of work to be done, but at least I could mitigate the business impact as I continue through the incident response journey. And when we take a look at those communications, we obviously do want to do it in integrating all these tools can be difficult if I'm not doing it in a low to no code way and not building a bunch of separate integrations, but building comprehensive flows that map to a business process. This does go back to the concept of value stream mapping, right? We want to identify weak points in our process, identify where we're hitting against the wall, and that wall happens to be maybe a silo in between teams or in between a process area. And we want to go beyond integrations, but be able to truly build orchestrations that are process-centric, business and technology process-centric, and not just technology-centric. It's not that difficult to integrate a piece of technology A and B. What's more meaningful is being able to automate processes that could transcend technology A, B, C, and D. And communications could be a really important part because some automations may require an approval. Maybe due to the potential impact, you don't want to just run them. And communications are also excellent ways to break down certain silos. So if I'm going to step into the shoes of a developer or a site reliability engineer, and I'm working within Jira because that's typically how I track my issues, I don't necessarily need to be inundated with the ins and outs of the organization's major incident management process in ServiceNow or in Remedy, for instance. If I could just click a button that says propose to major incident, and that communication could be the driver for that automation. Same thing for running automations, or maybe even all configurable buttons here, maybe rolling back code. So if I know that there's an issue going on with a recent release, don't let it escalate to a major incident. allow me to roll it back to the latest stable version by integrating with tools like GitHub and Jenkins, for instance. So communications are important because they need to transform from contextual to actionable. And then at the end, we do have the analytics piece, being able to continuously improve and seeing physical and digital incidents together. The digital world could impact the physical and vice versa. I could have, physical external events that could impact my infrastructure, which then could impact my digital services as well. So being able to understand the engagement and the response time and metrics is going to be of critical importance to improve over time. Digging into the specifics on the IT side, incident reporting is also really important. So incident management isn't done within one system by one team. It often transcends a lot of different technology stacks. But consolidating those insights into a single place does enable organizations to truly accelerate on the critical thinking front, being able to capture insights, performance, tools, and gain those insights to make their jobs easier in terms of finding the root cause and resolution of the issue. The other thing that we have towards the end is building things like post-incident reports. So having a consolidated timeline that actually shows you activity that's being done by various teams and various tools, by showing what the impacted services are for this one particular incident. As when incidents do go major, it's often more than one service that ends up being impacted. And who's engaged, and then also tracking in one consolidated environment that then of course feeds into all those other systems, such as, hey, maybe I need to do a roll forward fix, right? I need another release to fix this issue that was introduced. Maybe that's going to be ultimately tracked in Jira. Maybe there's other items that need to be tracked in ServiceNow. All of that still needs to trickle down to the respective systems, but there is value in seeing it all in one consolidated report. And a lot of time that could be saved by incident commanders and incident management teams that need to go and get this information. And this is just one consolidated view of just another way to visualize everything that we talked about when we manage critical events from a digital operations perspective, is take advantage of those existing investments and take that data, whether they be monitoring events or tickets, all into what we call signals, and being able to integrate that in a self-service fashion. Bulky and JavaScript-based integrations are going to be maybe okay today, but as your ecosystem rapidly changes, may not be okay tomorrow. You don't want high development overhead for keeping all these systems integrated. It's important that it's lightweight and self-service and doesn't require ongoing maintenance and cost over time. So that self-service element is really important. Smart routing, we need to be able to take those signals, enrich them with relevant data, and route them to the right personnel in a multimodal fashion, not just relying on email. We need to make sure that these alerts are actually bidirectional. They could actually feed data back into all of those systems, and most importantly, allow organizations to automate their processes. Collaboration is a big one, being able to integrate with multiple collaboration platforms and bring teams together that otherwise are digitally dispersed. And then we just reviewed some analytics to allow organizations from an incident management perspective to continuously improve. So with that, I did skip a couple slides for the technical glitch there, which I apologize for, but I think that does open up a little time for questions as well with the time that we have remaining. So I will address the first questions that I have here, and one is alerts with false alarms are not good. How do we avoid that? Yep, that's really important. Alerts with false alarms are not great, and one of the key things that we avoid is it's a two-part answer. One is signal enrichment. That concept of signal enrichment does help detect those false alarms, because a lot of systems are interconnected and there's a lot of monitoring solutions. And that does help us assess the validity of how real of a threat is this. Is this just a port was flapping somewhere in a monitor, but the issue is already resolved? So it's all about being able to have additional insights that we could correlate. If I'm having, an issue that's coming in from, a port just flapping, but there is no other signals that anything is wrong, that could be one thing that could cause that to be a false alarm. Now, the second part answer to that is flood control. There's a lot of systems that, maybe when I'm monitoring infrastructure, for example, and a port flapping isn't all that uncommon, maybe I want to set a threshold to make sure that, hey, most monitoring systems will continue to generate alerts. So being able to actually have rules and mechanisms in place that, hey, if I get, this many in this time period, then go ahead and send an alert so I don't wake people out of bed every time, we have some ports flapping or anything like that. That could be kind of common. So it's really understanding what are some of common alerts, what are not the common alerts, and being able to also enrich that with other contextual data in the environment. The other question that I'll go ahead and read and address is, what are the main problems and pains you are seeing to achieve digital resilience in financial institutions? Great question. In financial institutions, from a maturity index perspective, there's usually a significant amount of investments in technology tools. So technology is definitely not the problem. There's often a lot of it at its disposal. So this answer is also going to probably be a two-part answer. One is overloading of alerts, because there's so much investment on the technology side from a monitoring perspective and incident perspective. We do need that same concept of signal enrichment and service intelligence that we discussed. But the other challenge in FinServ specifically is it's a very highly regulated industry. And depending on the nature of the IT incident that you face, you likely need to also engage business functional areas that sit outside of IT. So when we really take a look at critical event management and look at it holistically, that is often a significant challenge that organizations have to fight through, is having, and most folks use their own tools, right? So having all these different tools for communication and collaboration don't help, when what's really needed is one centralized framework to manage critical events, both digital and physical, understanding that we have to rely on integrations and extend the value of some investments. But that's a significant challenge that's a little unique to FinServ and healthcare as well, is the highly regulated aspect of the industry and how often you actually need to, interface and loop in, regulators, controllers when you're dealing with IT incidents as well. So hopefully that answers that question. I will pause here to see if any other questions come in. And while if not, Cody, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. I was just going to say that while we wait for those questions, I'll go ahead and read our Amazon gift card winners out and give our audience just another minute to submit those questions. So our 4 winners of our $25 gift card drawing are Nizar S, Santosh G, Michael K, and Darlene W. So congratulations for the gift card. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim it. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. So I'm not seeing any more questions at this point. So Bart, I just wanted to give you the floor one last time to, in case you had anything you wanted to leave our audience with before we close out.
Nothing to add. Just thank you for everyone's attention. It's always a great pleasure to speak at events like this, and apologies for the technical glitch we experienced throughout, although it is fitting based on the topic that we discussed. So nothing but expressing my gratitude to the audience.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Bart, for being here, for putting together this presentation, and for taking the time to actually share your expertise with us. So we appreciate you being here today.
My
I want
pleasure.
to remind our audience that today's session was recorded. So following this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. And you can also find it on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. So I would like to extend our gratitude to Everbridge for sponsoring today's webinar. And my eternal thanks to you, our audience, for being here with us for the entirety of today's presentation. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you at a future TechStrong Learning webinar.